Education reform has become a very hot topic these days, and that's why we're so pleased that Dr. Thomas Hatch, co-director of the National Center for Restructuring Education, Schools, and Teaching, and an associate professor with Columbia University's Teachers College, will present his keynote speech today, What Does It Really Take to Improve Our Schools? He's known for his research that involves studies of large-scale education reform, as well as teacher quality in pre-K to 12 and higher education. Dr. Hatch spent the last year living in Norway with his family and studying the development and accountability systems in higher and lower performing countries on international tests. He produces websites that use multimedia to explore effective classroom practices and share teachers' expertise. And equally significant, Tom is a Cleveland native and the brother-in-law of our board chair, John Sada. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Tom Hatch.
Well, I think as Frank said, I am really delighted to be here for a wide variety of reasons, not the least of which is I'm delighted to be here to honor my brother-in-law, John Sada, as well as his fellow board members here. I'm also happy to be here to recognize the contributions of PEP and the work that they're doing for the Cleveland community. But as Frank indicated, as a Cleveland native, I continue to be inspired by the kind of civic commitment that so many people in this room show for what's happening in Cleveland. And that, of course, begins with my parents, particularly my father, who is here today, as well as my brothers and sister who, like many of you, continue to contribute so much to this community. Now, I know that this is a celebratory occasion, but as Frank was just indicating, and we all know, these are difficult times. And they're difficult times in education as well as in many other arenas. So the message that I want to get across today is a serious one, because I think, in fact, there are serious problems in education that we really do need to address. And in fact, even though in some ways we recognize that these are difficult problems, I'm not sure we really understand how difficult and how complex they are. So part of what I want to argue today is that we have to be really realistic about what it will actually take to improve our schools. There can be no quick fixes, no simple solutions. And even though we hear that all the time, we hear no quick fixes, no simple solutions, we still seem to gravitate toward them. So I want to make a different argument and suggest that if we really want to make improvements for all schools and all students, then we really have to make improvements at every level and in every aspect of the educational system. And for me, a large part of that is figuring out how we can bring together many different people and many different organizations with many different perspectives and personal and political differences and figure out how to work together. And as Frank indicated, one of the ways that I've developed this argument, and one of the things I want to draw on my remarks today, is some work that I've done studying what's going on in higher performing countries on international assessments, and that includes countries like Singapore, Finland, and the Netherlands. And it should be noted that while Singapore and Finland are centralized countries, the Netherlands is actually radically decentralized, kind of a loose collection of charter management organizations in some cases, and all three of these very different countries are performing quite well on international tests. But also, as Frank alluded to, I've spent some time both working in and studying some lower performing countries on these tests, and of course you might recognize that one of those is the United States. But you may not know that one of those countries is also Norway. I think from an American perspective, sometimes it's hard for us to tell the difference between Norway and Finland. There are some, but there are quite a lot of similarities. But one of the key differences is that somehow Finland is doing much better educationally, at least in terms of international test scores, than Norway. So while I think we often dismiss what's happening in Finland or in other countries by saying in the United States, oh, they're so different, you know, we can't learn anything from them. In Norway, which is very similar to Finland, they still haven't seemed to manage to figure out how to improve international performance on these tests. And so I think we can learn something from their experience as well as from that of Finland, Netherlands, and Singapore. Now, I only have about 20 minutes today, so what I want to do is take this step back and look at the policy and system perspective in these different countries. And I don't want to suggest that we can just take whatever a country like Finland is doing and then apply it here. But I do think that we can look internationally and get a sense and an opportunity to reflect on and think about the policies and practices in the kind of system that we have here. And one of the things I think we can do with the international data is to get a sense, put into some perspective, some of the solutions that we think are going to do the trick here in the United States. And often we turn to one solution or another and think that might work for us. For example, for a long time, I think we thought money would do the trick. And you don't need to look at this too carefully to just see that the United States is spending almost more than any other country per pupil. This was in 2009. Norway is also at the top of the charts in terms of spending, but again, those countries are lower performing than Finland and Singapore and others which spend substantially less. Another solution that we often turn to these days is time. If we could just extend the school day or extend the school year, then certainly that would lead to higher performance. However, once again, looking internationally, we see that there isn't much of a correlation between instructional time or hours of teachers and students in school and educational performance, as once again, the United States tops the charts, where Finland has substantially less instructional time. I would also say that Norway, like other Scandinavian countries like Finland, also doesn't have much instructional time. And my wife and I were introduced to that idea when on our first day of school, our 4th and 6th grade girls went off to school at 8:45 and returned promptly at 1:35, 4.5 hours later. So I can say for a fact, there is not that much instructional time in Scandinavia. But beyond time these days, one of the solutions that we often turn to is accountability. If we could just raise the stakes, if we could just provide better rewards and incentives, then we could figure out how to motivate people in the system, and that would lead to improved performance. Well, my colleague Pasi Sahlberg, who's a policymaker and researcher in Finland, is fond of sharing this graph, which shows that actually countries like the United States and the United Kingdom, which have essentially put in place significant accountability systems over the past 10 or 15 years, those countries have actually been going down in their international test performance, at least between 2000 and 2006, while Finland, which doesn't even have a word for accountability in Finnish, has been going up. So, no clear single solution can do the trick. The message that I take away from looking at what's going on in these higher performing countries is that in fact when we ask this question, what does it really take to improve all schools, not just one school at a time, but all schools, I think we have to conclude that it takes a system to raise every child. And for those of you who are involved in running and managing different organizations, I think you may be familiar with these key ideas. But I'd suggest that there are really 3 aspects of the educational system that we have to pay attention to all at the same time. We have to think about the technical capital that's available. That includes the funding, the facilities, the materials, the technologies. We have to pay attention to the human capital. That includes collective knowledge and abilities of teachers, support staff, and administrators. We need to pay attention to social capital, and that's the networks of relationships and trust, the shared understandings, the collective commitment, the connections between organizations like PEP and City Year and other institutions and the schools themselves. All of these are important. And what's more, all 3 of these are related. So as we were just talking about, money is not sufficient on its own. The resources on their own are not enough. In fact, we need people who have the skills and the expertise to use those resources effectively. And furthermore, if then we can get those people who have the skills and the resources to work together productively, to share information and expertise, to distribute responsibilities, then they can be much more efficient and much more productive. So all of these need to work together. I want to just spend a few minutes focusing on the importance of human capital because that's one of the areas in which I think many reformers in the United States, many reports now are focusing a lot of attention. So you may be familiar with some of these reports, both in the news and in policy and research circles. which are essentially saying that what we need to do is get the best teachers into the classroom, which of course is a great idea. But drawing from work in Singapore and Finland, essentially the argument goes, if we could just get the top high school graduates into the classroom, pay them well, and treat them with respect, then everything would work better, right? They would know what to do in order to reduce achievement gaps and enable all students to reach high standards of achievement. And again, as I said, while I think these are good things in general, I don't think they tell the whole story. So one of the first things that you see, I think, when you go to countries like Singapore and Finland is that they really have some of the best teacher preparation in the world. They have rigorous and significant coursework in the disciplines, but they also have courses in pedagogy, and they have guided practice in the schools. Beyond that, many of you may know that for those who go into college and then into teacher education, their fees are paid by the government. Furthermore, while teachers are learning to be teachers and while they're student teaching, they're paid a stipend. So that means that these very well-prepared teachers don't enter the workforce with 4 or 5 years or more of loans to pay off. It also means that they don't need alternate routes into teaching. This is one of the areas where I think there's an important and interesting contrast with Norway. So while Finland's teacher preparation is extremely rigorous, Norwegian teacher preparation has been quite weak for some time. In fact, up until a few years ago, it was possible for almost any certified teacher in Norway to teach at any grade level and in almost any subject. So it was a much broader, much more general teacher education, very different from what you see in Finland. And this issue of salaries, paying people well. Let's take a look at that for a minute. And you see that in Singapore and other high-performing countries like Korea, that actually is the case. They do have relatively high salaries. But once again, Finland is causing us problems because they're not paying their teachers that much relative to other professions, much more closely aligned to the United States. But I'd argue that what's happening in countries like Finland and Singapore, it's not how much teachers make in absolute terms that matters. What happens is they've been paid enough to take money off the table, as Daniel Pink says. Some of you may be familiar with him. He's the author of Drive. He's done a number of reviews of studies of motivation, which suggest that, in fact, monetary rewards and other forms of rewards are helpful for improving the performance of basic technical tasks, but actually decrease performance when it comes to complex and creative tasks like teaching. He does say, however, that money is still important. You need to make sure to pay people enough, right, so that they can actually focus on the work. And I'd argue that's what's happening in Finland and Singapore, where on a teacher's salary, you have an excellent standard of living. And that's extremely important. You can't become a doctor or a lawyer or a CEO, in fact, and have a much higher standard of living in many cases. So that allows teachers in Finland and Singapore to focus and to be attracted by things like the nature of the work, the good working conditions, and the respect for the profession. That's why they go into it, not for the money. And of course, you can see that's a little more complicated in a place like the United States, where teachers may be paid well in relationship to some other professions, but it certainly doesn't buy them the same quality of living or standard of life as other high-status professions like doctors, lawyers, and engineers.